Let's talk about something that sounds kind of boring, right? A trade dispute over steel and aluminum. It feels like it's a world away, something for politicians to argue about. But what if I told you that exact dispute is why the steak on your dinner plate might get more expensive? That it's threatening the livelihood of family ranchers, and it's causing a massive power shift in the global food supply chain. Today, we're going to unpack how a trade spat spiraled into a full-blown beef crisis that, believe it or not, affects all of us. Okay, let's get into it.
It all kicked off on November 16, 2025. And it wasn't some dramatic announcement, it was just a memo. A single piece of paper from one Canadian province. But as one source put it, that memo landed like a grenade. It set off an incredible chain reaction that sent the entire North American beef industry into a tailspin. And this one document, well, it exposed a huge vulnerability that had been hiding in plain sight for years.
So, what did this memo actually do? It was a blockade. Plain and simple. Ontario, Canada's biggest province, just flat-out rejected a shipment of 150,000 tons of U.S. beef. Now, that number is almost hard to wrap your head around. We're talking about enough beef to feed millions of people for months. Hundreds of millions of dollars of product just stopped at the border. This wasn't a warning shot. This was a direct economic hit aimed right at the heart of American agriculture.
So, here's our roadmap for today. We're going to follow the fallout from that single memo. We'll see how the crisis started, dig into the pandemic-era weaknesses that made the whole thing possible, and watch as global markets scrambled. Then, we'll see how Canada spotted a massive opportunity. And finally, we'll look at what this all means for your wallet and ask the big question, is this a permanent shift in who holds the power in the global food game?
Okay, so diving into that memo, this thing did not come out of nowhere. It was a calculated counterpunch. For months, trade tensions between the U.S. and Canada over stuff like steel and cars have been really simmering. The U.S. put tariffs on Canadian goods, and Canada was looking for a way to hit back where it would really hurt. Blocking beef? Well, that was like aiming a missile straight at a politically sensitive and economically crucial part of the U.S. economy.
And the effect was immediate and, honestly, brutal. With a huge export route suddenly slammed shut, all that American beef started piling up. Just imagine these massive storage freezers at ports from Texas to California suddenly overflowing with unsold meat. This created a huge surplus in the U.S., which caused prices to drop. Now, that might sound good at first, but for the ranchers, it was a total catastrophe. It wiped out their already paper-thin profit margins. It was a crisis from the farm all the way to the port.
But you gotta ask, how could one move from one province cause so much chaos? Well, it's because the U.S. beef industry was already on shaky ground. The pandemic had exposed some really deep structural problems. It created a perfect storm just waiting for a trigger. To really get why the whole system was so fragile, we need to rewind the clock just a little bit to the months right before this all went down.
So, in early 2025, Tyson Foods, one of the biggest players in the game, made two huge moves. First, they shut down their massive plant in Nebraska for good. Then, they cut production in half at their Texas facility. Why? Well, it was the lingering hangover from the pandemic, labor shortages, super high feed costs, and supply chains that were still a mess. By the middle of that year, as you can see, total U.S. beef output was already down a shocking 15%. The system was already stretched to its breaking point.
And those plant closures put a spotlight on a critical flaw in the system, something called centralized processing vulnerability. Basically, the U.S. beef industry had come to rely on just a handful of absolutely enormous processing plants to handle most of the supply. It's super efficient when everything's running perfectly, but it also means that if one or two of those mega plants has a problem, the entire food system can grind to a halt. It's a massive, single point of failure, and this trade war just blew the lid off of it.
Now, this problem didn't stay in North America for long. The instability in the U.S. supply chain sent tremors all across the globe. You had international buyers in places like Japan and Germany who count on a steady supply of American beef, and they started getting really nervous. All of a sudden, the world's biggest beef supplier looked unreliable, and that kicked off a quiet but very urgent scramble to find other options. And you can see how quickly these global buyers reacted. Japan, a massive market for U.S. beef, quietly cut its orders by 10%. Their reasoning? Supply reliability concerns. Over in Europe, German importers started looking to Australia and Brazil to fill the gap. Even the UAE hit pause on long-term contracts. They'd rather take their chances on the open market than be locked in with a partner they couldn't count on. It was basically a slow-motion vote of no confidence from America's biggest customers.
This quote from an importer in Tokyo, which ran in the Financial Times, just nails the shift in thinking perfectly. For decades, the best thing U.S. beef had going for it was its quality. But now, a new factor was suddenly just as important, maybe even more so: reliability. The political drama and the supply chain mess made U.S. beef look like a risky bet. And as we're about to see, another country was ready and waiting to deliver that stability.
So, while the U.S. industry was reeling from what was really a self-inflicted wound, its neighbor to the north saw a once-in-a-generation opportunity. Canada, which didn't have the same internal problems and was ready to capitalize on this perception of American instability, moved fast. They stepped in to fill the exact void that the U.S. was leaving in the global market.
But before we get into Canada's win, it's so important to understand the human cost of this on the American side. This quote from a Nebraska cattleman, man, it just brings it all home. For these ranchers, this wasn't just a number on a spreadsheet. They'd spent years raising these animals, invested everything they had, only to see the market they'd always counted on just evaporate. It was a threat to their entire way of life. The difference between the two countries couldn't be more dramatic. You look at the U.S. and they're dealing with processing bottlenecks, a glut of beef they can't sell, and prices so low they're bankrupting ranchers. Then you look at Canada. They're seeing a massive surge in exports, signing new deals all over Asia, and their brand is suddenly seen as a premium, reliable product on the world stage. It was a complete and total market reversal.
And the numbers for the U.S., they tell a pretty rough story. Projections showed exports could drop by 20%. At the exact same time, the cost of just raising the cattle was going through the roof. Feed costs were up 25%. Labor costs were up 15%. The ranchers were getting squeezed from every possible angle, forced to sell for less while their own costs were skyrocketing.
Now, just look at the contrast for Canada. While the U.S. was tanking, Canadian exports to those same key markets were booming. Shipments to Japan shot up 25%. Exports to the EU climbed 18%. They weren't just picking up the leftovers, they were actively capturing huge chunks of market share from their biggest competitor. They were signing the very deals their neighbors were losing.
And you know, this didn't just happen by accident. This wasn't just good luck. Canada's success was the result of a very deliberate long-term plan. For years, they had been quietly building alliances through new trade deals, investing a ton of money into the logistics needed for global exports, and marketing their beef as a safe, sustainable, premium product. When the opportunity showed up, they were ready to pounce.
Okay, so we've looked at the big picture, the trade deals, the global markets. But what does this all actually mean for regular people? From the ranchers trying to keep their farms afloat to the price you and I pay at the grocery store, this crisis has real, tangible costs. And those costs are now being felt everywhere. This table really breaks down the fallout. In the U.S., some estimates warn that up to 15% of small family ranches could go out of business by 2026. For you and me, the consumer, the supply chain crunch could mean beef prices jumping 10 to 15%. And globally, the World Trade Organization figures this whole mess could shave 0.5% off global GDP growth. That's a $500 billion hit to the world economy.
When you look at what the trade experts are saying, they're pretty much all in agreement. This is a textbook example of protectionist policies backfiring spectacularly. The tariffs were supposed to protect American industry, right? But by triggering retaliation, they ended up crushing one of the country's most vital export sectors. It's a classic case of a self-inflicted wound.
And all of this leads us to the final and most important question. Is this whole thing just a temporary crisis that'll eventually blow over? Or are we actually watching a permanent, fundamental shift in the multi-billion-dollar beef industry? The answer to that is going to have ripple effects for decades.
So which one is it? A little bit of turbulence or a permanent change? The thing is, the longer this trade dispute goes on, the more likely it is that these new supply chains become permanent. Those buyers in Asia who switch to Canadian beef, they might just stick with it, even if the tariffs disappear tomorrow. The U.S. is at real risk of losing its top spot for good.
So where do we go from here? Well, the stakes are absolutely huge. Canada is positioned to grab an even bigger piece of the premium global market. The U.S. has a choice to make: either find new customers and build a stronger system, or just let its ranchers become collateral damage in a trade war. There are ways out of this: special exemptions, a new deal, but the biggest hurdle, as always, is politics and stubbornness on both sides.
At the end of the day, if there is one big lesson to take away from this whole chaotic mess, it's this. For decades, the name of the game was quality. But in the volatile world we live in now, there's a new currency that matters even more:
Countries need to know their food supply is safe and predictable. In the global food game, it's not just about being the biggest anymore, it's about being the most dependable. Because when it comes right down to it, reliability wins.